Hi everyone. In this video, we are going to be taking a look at lesson 1-4, which is solving absolute value equations. Now, I'm a big fan of abbreviating. So when I use absolute value, I'm going to abbreviate it as ABSVAL, just so we all know. Okay. So just for our warm-up today, let's look at looking at absolute value expressions and noticing again what an absolute value symbol looks like and how it acts on an expression. So looking at this, we're asking for the absolute value of -7. And again, inside the absolute value bars is -7, and the symbol for absolute value are these bars here. So you might be asking yourself, well, how do I do this? What is absolute value? So I'm actually going to talk about that first. It's a number's distance from 0. And so when I ask you what the absolute value of -7 is, hopefully you would say 7, because -7 is 7 spaces from 0. So if this is 0 in the number line, this is -10. Here's -7. And it is 7 spaces. Now it's to the left of 0, but it's still 7 spaces away from 0. So when we measure distance, it's always a non-negative number. Being non-negative, by the way, is different than being positive because being non-negative includes the value 0. So non-negative numbers are 0 and above. Positive numbers are right above 0. So, 0.000001 is the first positive value and to the right. Similarly, being non-positive would include 0 and below versus just being negative. In the second example, in the absolute value bars, we have the expression -7 plus 4. So these act like grouping symbols, which means before we do the absolute value, we actually want to add inside. So -7 plus 4 is -3, and now we take the absolute value of -3, which is 3. In this last example, the addition sign is outside of the absolute value bars. I still have the same numbers I used, -7 and 4, but this time I take the absolute value first, because the addition is outside, and then I go ahead and add 7 and 4. So as you can see, even though I'm using the same numbers in the first and or the second and third problems, they have completely different answers based on the order of operations because absolute value bars act like grouping symbols. Now, if we go back to our key term for a second, there's actually another number who is also 7 spaces away from 0, and that is +7. So here's +10, here's +7, and this is also 7 spaces away from 0. So if we think about absolute value and we're asking ourselves, what number has an absolute value of 7, or what number is 7 spaces away from 0, there's actually two possibilities, -7 and +7. And that's actually going to impact what we're doing next, which is solving an absolute value equation. So let's look at problem 1. And actually, let's change this from a 9, everybody, to a 7. You know what? Because that's what we were working with before. My question here is solve absolute value of x is 7. So again, what I'm essentially is asking is what number is 7 spaces from 0? That is what I'm asking, but I'm doing it in a mathematical way, which means I'm using a lot of symbols to express this idea. And again, as we looked at above in our key term, the answer is 7 and -7. So this equation has two answers. If we wanted, we could combine them into one notation form by using what mathematicians call the plus or minus symbol. And that's when we want to indicate a number and its opposite, so a positive value and a negative value. We use the plus or minus right number. Again, we love shorthand and math, so that's one way that we might see that. So I would say x is plus or minus 7. Even though we don't normally say like plus 7, I would just say, and I wouldn't even say positive 7, I would just say 7. That symbol is plus or minus. When we solve absolute value equations, what we really want to do is isolate the absolute value. And then after that, I'm going to put a 1 here. We want to write and solve two equations. We're going to look at those steps in 1 second, but before we do that, I want to look at a slightly different problem in problem number 2. Here I'm asking you what number is negative 6 spaces away from 0. Going back to our definition, again, of absolute value, is that absolute value is a non-negative number. So this equation here has no solution. There is no number that is negative 6 spaces away from 0 because distance is always a positive number. This is something we're going to see again, and we kind of want to watch out for that negative idea. We're going to do some harder examples in class when we're all together, but just keep this in the back of your mind. So these next two examples are a little bit more difficult. We're adding another layer because there's actually an inverse operation associated with them. In these first two examples, we were just looking at the isolated absolute value and just kind of discussing what sort of answers would make sense and what mathematically is correct. Like I said, we want to isolate the absolute value. So in problem 3, this absolute value is already isolated. In problem 4, I want you to notice, again, I'm using the same operation minus the same number 9 and the same answer 8, which I did on purpose. But here I want you to notice the absolute value is not isolated. So these two problems are actually solved differently and they have different solutions. Kind of like the warm-up question where I gave you the same numbers, also absolute values with something different based on the order of operation. In problem 3, the absolute value is already isolated, meaning it's the only thing on one side of the equation. And since it's equal to something that's non-negative, I know I have a solution. And I can go ahead then and write two equations. And I like to just kind of draw these little arrows here, sort of a way to remind my brain that I need to draw two things. So again, what numbers minus 9 are 8 spaces from 0? Well, either numbers minus 9 could be 8 spaces away, so they could be on the right of that, or the numbers minus 9 be to the left, so they could be negative 8. So this is where the write and solve two equations piece is coming from. I don't actually write the absolute value bars anymore because now I'm dealing specifically with the expression in the absolute value bars. It's just after I look at what the absolute value is, this is what I end up with, these two equations. They can each be solved by adding 9 to both sides. And I get x equals 17 for my first solution and x equals 1 for my second. So what numbers minus 9 are 8 spaces away from 0? 17 and 1. I'm going to confirm that with a check. So I'm going to have to erase some things that I did. So is the absolute value of 17 minus 9 equal to 8? Oops, it should be a 9. Here again, I would do what's in the parentheses, in the absolute value bars, which act like grouping symbols. The absolute value of 8, is it equal to 8? Yes, yes it is. If instead of 17, I put 1, 1 minus 9 is negative 8, but the absolute value of negative 8 is also 8, again, making our statement true, and therefore that is a solution. Sorry, it does not look like this is an absolute value bar, but it is right here. Let's look at this next example. In this one, we don't have our absolute value isolated. So what we have to first do is add 9 to both sides. So we isolate the absolute value. When I do that, I get the absolute value of x equals 17. And now it's isolated, I can write my two equations. There's actually not much to write here because the only thing in my absolute value bars is the value x. unlike here where I had an expression. So again, what number has a 17 spaces away from 0? Either 17 or negative 17, which you can again confirm by substituting 17 in for x, taking its absolute value and subtracting 9 to get 8, or substituting negative 17 in. These can get a lot more complicated, but I wanted to stop here. I just wanted to give you some foundational concepts and ideas of solving an absolute value equation. And then when you really start doing the more difficult types of problems, I wanted to be there with you in class. So when we come back together, we'll look at 2 more problems together, and then I will give you some examples. So again, make sure you have all this written down in your notes and bring this with you, and we'll keep building on this next time. Thanks, everyone.